Hi, welcome to this session in which we are going to harmonise a chorale melody in the style of Bach. Now this is something you may want to know about because you're a university or college music student who's maybe facing this challenge on a course, or it may simply be that it's something you're interested in, or it may be that you're more interested in how to find chords that fit with a given melody. But it will suit any of those purposes. So here we have on the board a chorale melody. Now I have to start by saying that this isn't a real chorale melody. I've just made one up in the style of a chorale melody for copyright reasons. But it's the kind of melody that composers like Bach would have worked with. And Bach inherited these chorale melodies in the life of the church, and he decided to reharmonise them to make them rather more interesting. So that's what we're going to set about this evening to see how we get on with this. Where do we begin? Well, first of all, let's talk about these pause marks. And you may already know that the pause marks in Bach chorales don't actually mean pause marks at all. They're merely there to indicate the end of a phrase. But that's very critical stuff for us because we need to know where each phrase is going to end. So we've got three phrases ending where the pause marks are indicated. And one thing we'll want to do fairly early on is to have a look through the given chorale melody and decide on the key structure. Well, the key signature tells us we've got two sharps to deal with. So that means we're either in the key of D major or in the key of B minor. And I'm assuming for the purposes of this film that people know about key signatures. If that's slightly hazy for you, you can find a free film on YouTube that we've done about the circle of fifths that will tell you all about that. Anyway, are we in D major or in B minor? Well, we've got three Ds to start, so D is maybe coming up front there. We've got D at the end, so it's maybe looking more like D major than B minor. If the chorale melody were to be in B minor, we might expect to see some A sharps. Well, can't see any A sharps. I can see quite a few A naturals around, but no A sharps. There might just be a G sharp in B minor, and there is a G sharp there, so that's the only thing that might just make us think for a brief moment about B minor. But on balance, we're really in the key of D major. And the G sharp something we need to come back to very shortly because it might be indicating a change of key, a modulation. So let's have a look at the first phrase, and it looks as if it's going to sit quite comfortably in the key of D major. So I wonder what this cadence is going to be at this point, because when you harmonise a chorale, it's often a good idea to begin with keys and cadences. If I look at this A, well, A could belong to chord 1 or it could belong to chord 5. So we've the option here of more than one possible cadence. So we're going to have to think about that in a moment. When we get to the end, we're finishing on D. It's the last chord of what is, in this case, a fairly short chorale. So that's probably going to finish on a chord 1. Let's just be sure about our chords before we go any further. So just a reminder of how we locate the chords that we need for the key of D major. So there's our key signature, and obviously I'm going to write a scale of D major. Here come the notes for that. I don't need D at the top because I've got D at the bottom. And to find the chords, I add a third and a fifth above each note of the scale. So here they come. And sometimes it's quite helpful to do this just so you can actually see quite readily what the options are for the chords. And we always label these, of course, in Roman numerals. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So you can see if we look at the last note first, there's a D, and D sits in chord 1, and that's really the most logical place for our chorale to finish. So you might even want to begin with the very last chord. You see what I was talking about here though? We've got an A at this cadence, and if we're having a cadence here, well, it could be a perfect cadence, which is chord 5 followed by 1. It could be a plagal cadence, chord 4 followed by 1. It could be an imperfect cadence, which is technically anything followed by 5, but it's normally 1 to 5, 2 to 5, or 4 to 5. It can't really be an interrupted cadence, so we can eliminate that one. But for the time being, let's go for a chord 1. Though we need to check it out with the chord before, because if we're going to finish on a chord 1, this is going to have to be a perfect cadence or a plagal cadence. So we've either got to go 5 here or 4. Well, if we look at 5, 5 is A, C sharp, E, and B does not belong to chord 5, so it can't be a perfect cadence. Chord 4, however, G, B, D, that's got this B in it, so it could be a chord 4. So we might be looking at a plagal cadence there. Okay, but you could go 4 to 5 and call it an imperfect cadence, so that's another option. And of course, one thing about any kind of harmonisation, including harmonisation in the style of Bach, is that quite often there's more than one option. Right at the end, we might just deal with this cadence. I wonder what this chord could be. If this is a chord 1, it's either got to be a perfect cadence or a plagal cadence. So we need to look at this E and decide whether this E fits in chord 5 or in chord 4. Well, 5 is A, C sharp, E, so it fits there. 4 is G, B, D, doesn't fit chord 4. So it looks as if this is going to be a 5-1. So that's quite handy. We've got a plagal cadence here, which if we want to, we could turn into an imperfect cadence by going 4-5, but we've got a perfect cadence at the end, 5-1. Okay, what about this middle phrase? Because if we look at this middle phrase here, we can see that what's happened is that a G sharp has been introduced. And the last note of this phrase is A. Well, if I've got F sharp and C sharp and I add G sharp, that is in fact the next sharp in the circle of fifths. So that's suggesting that we might possibly have modulated to the key of A major. That would be perfectly logical because A major is the dominant key of D major. So it's looking like A major, isn't it? If it's modulating to A major and we can get a chord 1 in here, that will make it a nice strong modulation and a nice strong cadence. So if I was to think about these chords in A major for a moment, it might just be helpful if we put these alongside. So there we are. And the scale of A, I'm going to start it down here, will look like this. And it would be helpful if I put 3 E sharps into the key signature. There they go. And we do the same thing, of course. We add a 3rd and a 5th above each of these notes to give us all the chords that we need for the key of A major. So there they are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So, if we're in A major at this point, does this A fit chord 1 in A major? Well, yes, A is at the bottom of that. So it's looking fairly safe as a 1 in A major. So we might be able to step back from that 1 in A major now and say, if the cadence finishes on a 1, then it will have to be preceded by a 4 or a 5. If it's a perfect cadence, it's going to go 5 to 1. If it's a plagal cadence, it's going to go 4 to 1. So in the key of A major, does G sharp fit with chord 5 or with chord 4? Well, chord 4, D, F sharp, A, no G sharp there, so that doesn't fit. Chord 5, E, G sharp, B would fit very nicely. So maybe we're going to go for another perfect cadence, and don't worry about the fact we've got a perfect cadence at the end and we've got a perfect cadence here as well, because actually we're in two different keys. So you see that in terms of the initial planning, this is quite a good way to begin the task, just thinking about keys and then thinking about cadences, so we know where each of these phrases is going. Now let's go back to the beginning of the chorale and see if we can start plotting some chords. You've probably noticed that this chorale has an anacrusic start. In other words, it doesn't begin on the first beat of the bar. In this case, it starts one beat before the first bar line, what's sometimes called an upbeat. And quite often when you have an anacrusic start, the anacrusic beat here is a chord 5 followed by a chord 1. That's often an effective start. But it's not going to work in this case because chord 5, in the key of D of course, doesn't have a D in it. A, C sharp, E, not going to fit the first chord. So even though quite often you would use 5 as the anacrusis onto 1 if that fits, we're not going to do that here. So don't just assume that that will always fit, because it won't here. So if that's not going to work, we want to start on a chord 1 if we can, because we're keen to establish the key of D major. And thankfully D fits with chord 1. So let's commit to that. Now I've purposely done something at the beginning of this chorale which sometimes comes up when you're working these harmonisations, and it can be a bit of a pain. And the problem is this: we've got 3 Ds. Now it could be very easily the case that the chorale gets stuck right at the beginning, because we might just think, well, chord 1, chord 1, chord 1. But if I start the chorale going 1, 1, 1, it's actually going to get off to a pretty dull start. So I need to think of some options. It could be that I could go from 1 to 1B, in other words, chord 1 in first inversion, or it could be that I could look for another chord with D in it. Now here's something that's just worth thinking about, which will have occurred to many people before. Any note that we're trying to harmonise will be the root of one chord, it will be the middle, the third of another chord, and it will be the top or the fifth of another chord. So there'll always be 3 chords at least that will fit that note. I say at least because you might also find that there are things like 7th chords that give you additional options. But for now, let's just start with the basics. We've already used chord 1. So here's D, and we said that D is at the bottom of chord 1, but D is also in the middle of this chord, which is chord 6, B, D, F sharp, and D is also the top of this chord, which is chord 4, G, B, D. So 1, 6 and 4 all fit those Ds. So we could mess around maybe with inversions of chord 1, or we could utilise 6 and or 4. Well, for now, how about we do this? We start with chord 1 and we go to chord 6, and then maybe move on to chord 4. That would give us 3 different chords. How would that actually sound? Here's 1, here's 6, and here's 4. So you can hear those 3 different colours of those 3 different chords, which is much better than getting stuck on 1, 1, 1. And if we go from 1 to 1B, well, we've either got to repeat 1B or go back to 1 again, because we probably don't want to use 1C. Second inversions have to be used with great care. So if you come across a second inversion, what we call a C chord, we can only use that in particular places. Sometimes you can have a 4C followed by a 1. That's one place in which it's used. Much more commonly, you have a 1C followed by a 5. So you go 1C5 or you go 1C5, 1. But otherwise, we don't just stick in second inversions most of the time. So it's really root position chords and first inversion chords. Anyway, for now, 3 notes, each has its own chord. 1, 6, 4. Now our chorale is finally on the move, and we have a C sharp next. So again, we can think, okay, well, C sharp's got to be the root of one chord. Here it is, it's the root of 7, isn't it? And C sharp must be the middle of something. Well, here it is, chord 5. And C sharp must be the top of something. Here it is, chord 3. Well, 7 is a chord we need to be a little bit careful about, because you might just be tricked into thinking that because we're in a major key, all these chords are major chords, but actually they're not. In a major key, chords 1, 4 and 5 are the major chords in the key, but chords 2 and 3 and 6 are actually minor chords. And chord 7 is something else again. Chord 7 is a diminished chord, and you can probably hear it's got a different feel to it. And some textbooks advise you to avoid chord 7 like the plague. 7 can be used very effectively in some places, but it certainly needs to be used with care. 7's therefore the least likely chord to be used, and 3 after 7 is usually the next weakest chord. Again, it can be used very effectively, but doesn't tend to get used that often. So if we've got a choice of 7, 5 or 3, 5 is the most likely thing that we're going to go for here. So let's go for a chord 5. Then let's look on to the next beat, because there's something interesting going on here. You can see in the melody that we've now got 2 quavers. Now we could find a chord that fits the D, then we could look for a chord that fits the C sharp, and then we could go on and find a chord that fits this B. But if I have a chord on this quaver, and then on this quaver, and then on the next beat, the chords are going to move very quickly, and it can have quite a kind of unsettling effect on the music. So say I went for 3 chords there, you can suddenly hear what's happening to the music. It's getting very agitated. And so far, we've had 1 chord for each beat. This is what we call the harmonic rhythm. So the harmonic rhythm is working in crotchets. Every crotchet beat, we seem to be looking at a new chord. So we probably don't want to harmonise both of those quavers. Now we could harmonise the D, and then the C sharp would just pass by on its way to the next chord. Or we could maybe harmonise the C sharp and experience this D as a kind of dissonance, a kind of appoggiatura note. But maybe for now, the best thing we can do is to harmonise the D. This means that the C is called a passing note. The C sharp here is a passing note. What constitutes a passing note? Well, the C sharp is passing by step between the D and the B. And to qualify as a passing note, it's important that it does just that. It passes by step. So you can't have a leap. You couldn't have D, C sharp dropping to A, for example. But D, C sharp to B, it's all going by step. It could go the other way. B, C sharp, D. Doesn't matter. As long as it's going by step between 2 harmony notes. In other words, 2 notes that are going to attract a chord. And because this passing note comes between the beats, we'll have a chord on the 4th beat of this bar, then we'll have the passing note on that last quaver in between beats 4 and beat 1 of the next bar. Because the passing note's between beats, we say it's an unaccented passing note. If the passing note comes on the beat, then we can say it's an accented passing note. Accented passing notes are stronger. Here's an accented passing note. You can hear how strong that note is at the top. Here it comes now. That's an accented passing note. If I do it as an unaccented passing note, it goes like this. And you can hear the passing note still there, but it's far gentler. So, quite often you'll find that the passing notes in chorales are unaccented passing notes. Not always, but quite often. So if we harmonise the D, find a chord for the D, we can allow that C sharp to pass by without worrying about whether it belongs to the chord or not. Okay, well, we're back dealing with D again. We had 3 Ds to kick off, and here we are back with another D. So we know that D fits with chord 1, chord 6 and chord 4. So do we want to go back to 4? Well, we've just left that. We've got a 4 coming up, so maybe that's not such a good idea. Do we want to go to a 6? Well, we could do. Is there something else we could do? Well, how about this? We go back for a chord 1, but this time we call it 1B. In other words, it's chord 1 in first inversion. Now, what do I mean by that? Here's chord 1, D, F sharp and A. And as long as I use the notes of that triad, I can arrange my chord in any way I want to. So here's a chord using those 3 notes, D, F sharp and A. Here's another chord that's just the same, but with the notes differently organised. Here's another one. Here's another one. Here's another one. So as long as I've got those 3 notes, D, F sharp and A, I'm dealing with chord 1. If it's 1 on its own, it's what we call 1A. If you see nothing at all, then nothing means A. And all that means is it's the notes of chord 1 in root position with the bottom note at the bottom. So you see I've always got D at the bottom of my chord 1. Wherever I'm arranging my notes, there's D at the bottom. Could be in a different octave, could be there, could be here. But as long as D's at the bottom, it's 1A, 1 in root position. If I put F sharp at the bottom, but I'm still using these notes, D, F sharp and A, then we're using chord 1 in its first inversion and we label it 1B. So here's an example of a 1B chord. So do you see what I've got in this chord? I've got D's, F sharp and A, but the F sharp is in the bass this time. I could rearrange it in some other way, but if it's using these notes, D, F sharp, A, is chord 1, but if F sharp's at the bottom, it's 1B. And of course, logic tells us that if A were to go at the bottom of this same chord, it would be in second inversion and we would call it 1C. So here's 1C, it's D, F sharp and A, but with A in the bass. And I can again arrange this chord in any way I want to. I can drop the A, say another octave, but that's 1 in its second inversion. And you'll remember earlier on I was saying second inversions have to be handled with care. If you listen to this 1C, this 1 in second inversion, you can feel it's kind of pulling somewhere else. So a second inversion chord is a bit weaker than a root position or a first inversion because it's always pulling to somewhere else. Okay, I've gone for a 1B here. Why have I done that? I don't just want to go back to 1 or 6 or 4 because we've just had them fairly recently. And also all of our chords so far have been root position chords. And it's quite nice if you can, during the course of your chorale, to get a bit of a balance between root position and first inversion chords. Okay, well, we've got 4-1 going on to the cadence. There's another B there, isn't there? So what else would fit with B? Well, there's a B in chord 2, isn't there? We've already talked about the chord 4. There's a B in chord 6. So those are options. I'm going to suggest something else in due course, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. For now, let's just move on to the second phrase. Now, we've already said that this phrase modulates to A major, the dominant key. And remember, these are our A major chords when we need them. When we modulate from one key to another, it's important that we use something called a pivot chord. What's a pivot chord? I like to think of it as a kind of musical door. You know, if you go from one room to the next room, you have to go through the door. You can't just walk through the wall. So the door is your point of access between two spaces, between two rooms. A pivot chord is a chord that belongs to both the key you're leaving and the key to which you're going. So let's have a look and see if we can find any pivot chords, because we're going to need one. If I look at chord 1 in D major, I can see that it's also chord 4 in A major. So 1 is a pivot chord. If I look at chord 2 in D major, you might be thinking, oh great, there's another one, look, because there's chord 5 in A major. No, that's not a pivot chord, because this is E, G natural, B. That's chord 2, isn't it, in D major, following the key signature. But in A major, we've got E, G sharp, B, because of the key signature. So 2 is not a pivot chord. What about chord 3? Well, there's 3 in D. Can we see that chord? Yes, we can. It's 6 in A. What about chord 4? Well, this is looking promising. It's looking a bit like 7 in A. But no, it's not, because 4 in D has got a G natural at the bottom. 7 in A's got a G sharp at the bottom. So you've got to be very careful about accidentals, that they don't catch you out with pivot chords. Chord 5 in D, A, C sharp, E. Well, here it is. It's chord 1, A, C sharp, E. Don't worry that I've got that in a different octave. Chord 6 in the key of D is also chord 2 in the key of A. Chord 7, another one that could catch you out, looks as if it's going to be a chord 3 in A, but of course chord 3 in A has a G sharp in it. So some of these chords are pivot chords, others are not. But if we are going to modulate from the key of D to the key of A, we'll need to find a pivot chord through which we can pass. Well, as luck would have it, this chord 1 in D, D, F sharp, A, we've already said is actually chord 4 in A. So we have a pivot chord at this cadence that we can use. So when you're modulating, always look for a pivot chord that you can go through, particularly in this kind of style. By the 19th century, composers are starting to be a little bit looser about this, and sometimes they just use a pivot note to go from one key to another. They're not so fussed about pivot chords. But most of the time, back in the Baroque period with Bach, you're going to find that you need a pivot chord there. So there's a pivot chord. Having gone through a pivot chord, we can then carry on in A major. So now we're wanting to find chords that fit this phrase from our A major selection. So let's have a look at what we might do next. Well, a chord of A major might be sort of quite handy at this point, mightn't it? Because we're wanting to go to A major. So there's A. A, of course, is going to fit with chord 1 in A major. So we could go for a chord 1 there. How about we go for a 1B? Don't have to. But a 1B gives us another first inversion chord. We've had quite a lot of root position chords. There's another first inversion chord. You can always change your mind about this, of course, as you go. There may be things that happen later on that make some of the chord choices a little bit awkward and you want to change your mind. But let's go for a 1B for the time being. F sharp coming up. So where does F sharp fit in this? We've got an F sharp in chord 2, an F sharp in the middle there of chord 4, haven't we? We've got an F sharp up here in chord 6. So we've got quite a few possibilities there, haven't we? I'm going to go for a chord 4. One reason why I'm going to go for a chord 4 is it's actually going to make for quite a good bass line. If I use 1B here, it's going to go C sharp, and the root of a 4A chord is going to be D. So having the bass going by step might be quite a nice thing to do. Anyway, again, we can always change our mind about that if we want to. Then we've got a B. Well, B certainly fits with chord 2, doesn't it? And where else do we find a B? We've got a B in chord 5. We've got a B over here in chord 7. Remember, we're being a little bit cautious with chord 7, so that's going to limit the possibilities a little bit. How about we go for a chord 2? One note to find here before we have our perfect cadence, our 5-1 cadence. One thing we could do here is to use a 1C. Now I can feel you all jumping up and down saying, well, didn't you just tell us not to use second inversion chords? Well, I did say use them with care, and I did say that if you use a 1C, it's normally followed by a chord 5. Well, 1C5 fits in very nicely here, and quite often you have a cadence progression that goes 1C, 5, 1. So that might actually work quite nicely for us at that point. Okay, we've now cadence in the key of A. We now need to think about coming home because we're finishing in A and the last phrase is very firmly back in D major. We've got a G natural here, so there's no point in staying in A major, or we're going to have a clash with this G natural because A major, of course, has a G sharp in it. So we need to be moving back to D pretty quickly. Well, as luck would have it, chord 1 in A major is also chord 5 in D major. So in fact, this might be the one in A major at the cadence, but it's also a pivot chord to take us back home. So that makes life much easier, doesn't it? So from now on, we can think in the key of D again. So I perhaps should have made it clear back here that all of this is in the key of A. And now we're going to go back into D. So I wonder what chord is going to fit with this A. Back here we are with the D major chords. Well, A's in chord 1, that's quite helpful. A's in chord 5. And we've also got an A in chord 3. Remember we said chord 3 is a slightly kind of rare chord, isn't it? If I use chord 5, well actually that's the same as chord 1 in A, and we just had that chord, so there's a slight danger of getting a little bit stuck if we use the same chord again. So maybe the answer is to go for a 1. So there's chord 1. Let's go on to the next one. We're almost there with the chords. Here's a G. Where does G fit into the proceedings? Well, there's a G in chord 2. There's a G in chord 4, isn't there? There's also a G up here in chord 7. Well, we're sort of trying to avoid the 7s, aren't we? But we've had quite a few 4s along the way. Haven't had 2, have we really? So we had a 2 back here, but maybe there's an opportunity to use a chord 2. As well as just thinking about a little bit of variation between root position and first inversion chords, you might also think about creating a bit of variety between major chords and minor chords. So remember, in a major key, chords 1, 4 and 5 are major and the rest are minor apart from chord 7 being diminished. Interestingly, in a minor key, the major chords are chords 5 and 6 and the other chords are a bit of a mixture of all sorts of things. Chord 1 is minor, chord 2 is diminished, chord 3 is augmented, chord 4 is minor, chord 7 is diminished again, bit of a mixture in minor keys. But just thinking about the balance of major and minor chords is something else to consider. So there's chord 2, minor chord, in the context of other chords here which so far are major chords. F sharp is the next note. Well, F sharp's in chord 1. I'm sort of loath to use chord 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. We've had enough 1s, haven't we, really? Chord 3, well, we could use chord 3, I suppose, but again, as we said before, it's a less frequent chord in the kind of harmonic language. Chord 6, now there's a possibility to have that F sharp as a part of a chord 6. So why don't we go for a chord 6 there? And we haven't had a 6 for a while. And it's rather nice, 2 minor chords sitting next to each other there. Now, we're 1 note short of a chord here, just this E. Well, we've got an E coming up and we've already made a decision to harmonise that E with a chord 5, so we probably don't want to use chord 5 again. There's also E in chord 7. Well, yes, chord 7 we're not too happy about. That leaves us with the possibility of chord 2. So, okay, we've had 2, but let's just go for 2 for a moment. And I'm going to suggest a little elaboration of that chord 2. We could make this 2, 7, B. My goodness me, what's all this about? Well, one very, very common progression at cadences in Bach chorales is this one. 2, 7B, 5, 1. Sometimes it's a 5, 7 as well, but 2, 7B, 5, 1. What does that mean? Here's a chord 2. E, G, B. I make it a 7th by adding a D to it. So I've got a root, a 3rd, a 5th and a 7th. And then I put it all in first inversion. So I've got that G at the bottom. And so that gives me 2, 7B, followed by a 5, followed by a 1. And that's a very common Bach progression. So we use the 1C, 5, 1 progression here. And now we're going to use the 2, 7B, 5, 1 progression at the end. Great, now it's taken quite a long time to get that far, but we've covered a lot of ground. Time to start getting some notes into this chorale. Having got all your chords, and you review that and be fairly happy that you've got a reasonable balance of chords, we then want to get a bass line that fits with these chords. Now you might be surprised at this, but I'm going to start the bass quite high. You've got to be careful that you don't end up with a bass part that's not too high, otherwise it's difficult to fit the other notes in. But there's reason for this, which I'll come to. But D is the root of 1. Let's see if we can now plot the bass line in accordance with the chords, because B is the root of 6, G is the root of 4, and then A is the root of 5. Then F sharp will be the bass note, because this is 1B, remember, so we need an F sharp in the bass. What I'm going to do here at the moment is I'm going to put a G in there, and then just to, rather than just repeat the G, I'm going to take it down an octave, because that gives us a bit of variety before we come back to D. You'll find in Bach chorales that quite often the bass line is reasonably stable, quite a bit of stepwise movement going on, but sometimes you get these octave leaps, and they quite often happen at cadence points. Okay, let's just carry on for a moment with the bass line. Now we're going into A major, remember, and we're looking for a 1B, so there's C sharp. Remember I was saying earlier that by using a 1B, I've made the bass line go a bit smoother here. And here's chord 4, so we need D there. Chord 2 will need a B in the bass. 1C, A, C sharp, E, but because it's 1C, second inversion, I'm going to need an E in the bass there. E again for chord 5, and then maybe down to A for the root of chord 1. Now this is chord 1 again, but don't forget we've gone back to the key of D. So here we are again. The root of chord 1 is D. The root of chord 2 is E. Then we're looking for a root of chord 6, which is B. Now, what's at the bottom of 2, 7, B? Well, we need to find our 2. There's E, G, B. Here's our 7th. I'll just sort of put that in brackets so we can see it. But because it's a first inversion, this third, this G, is going to be in the bass. So there it goes. Chord 5, the root is going to be A for that. And we're going to come back to D as the root of our chord 1. So you see, having got those chords sorted out and the keys, it's a relatively quick job to get the bass line going. Bass line's looking okay. I think we can spruce it up a bit further. You remember we talked about these passing notes earlier on, how they just connect by step between two harmony notes. Whenever you have the interval of a third in any one line, soprano, alto, tenor or bass, you've always got the possibility of joining that up with a passing note. Now we have to be a little bit careful, because if we go sticking passing notes all over the place, sometimes it gets a bit much, and sometimes people have passing notes in all 4 parts all going at the same time. It's not usually a great idea. You can have double passing notes going on in 2 parts at the same time, but handle with care, and quite often single passing notes are the answer. But I'm looking at this bass. It starts D, B, G. Well, that's fine, isn't it? But hey, we could fill this in with some passing notes. This is going to make life much more exciting. So how about I put a C sharp in there, and I put an A in here. And so instead of just going D, B, G, I've now got a bass line that does this. Suddenly it's sounding a bit more interesting, especially when I put it with a soprano part without the passing notes. Put the passing notes in. Bit of movement in the bass, which is nice, isn't it? Well, there's another opportunity here, isn't there? Between the A and the F sharp. And this is a particularly effective one, and I'll explain why. Because this A is the root of a chord 5, as we were explaining earlier. This G passing note happens to turn this 5 into a 5-7 chord. Look, here's chord 5, and that G is the 7th. It so happens that the 7th is in the bass, so it becomes a 5-7 in its last inversion, what we call 5-7D, really. But it's not really a 5-7D chord, it's just a passing note. But it happens that this passing note strengthens the 5 by making it feel as if it's some kind of 5/7D in passing. So that's a particularly good passing note to use there. So that's good. Now, anything else coming up in the bass? Well, there's a third here, isn't there? And we could possibly think about slipping a passing note in there just to make it slightly more interesting. And then if I look a bit further on, here's another third that I might decide would be worthy of another passing note. Okay, well, this means that we had a top and a bottom part that sounded like this before the passing notes. Doesn't sound too bad. One thing you'll notice about that is that sometimes the top and the bottom go in similar motion, but some of the time there's a bit of contramotion between the top and the bottom. You know, they're moving in opposite directions. The top part's coming down, the bass part's going up. So a little bit of that movement in the bass part when there isn't movement in the upper part, and vice versa. You know, I'm not doing anything here because there's a passing note up here. But with just that one passing note in the soprano, having some more passing notes in the bass gives that passing note a little bit of a context. So here we go with all the passing notes. Okay, now there are details missing because we haven't written the alto and tenor parts in yet, but you begin to get a feel for the bass part beginning to have a kind of identity of its own. Okay, now having got that far, we now need to fill in these middle parts, and we need to fill them with the other notes of these chords. Okay, now what do? We're writing in 4 parts. We've got soprano, alto, tenor, bass. We've only got 3 notes in one of these chords, one of these triads. So it means that a lot of the time we're going to be doubling one of the notes. In fact, we started with that because we've got a D in the soprano and a D in the bass. So chances are the F sharp and the A are going to be the notes we need for the alto and for the tenor. Now, you could do all of the alto part, then come back and do all of the tenor part, or you could think about them as a sort of combined effort and maybe do something like that. So I've got D's for the top and the bottom, and the A and the alto and the F sharp in the tenor. Now you might think, goodness, that's quite a high start. It is. You don't want your basses any higher. I've purposely done this to show you about as high as the bass line wants to go. The tenor is quite often using ledger lines above the bass clef stave, so don't be frightened of taking the tenor up. Certainly you can take the tenor up to a G. After that, you're beginning to make life a little bit difficult for tenors, and they won't thank you for being crucified too high in the range, but G would work for it quite nicely. Okay, let's go on. Chord 6. Here's chord 6, B, D, F sharp. So how about we do something like this? I'm going to put a B in the alto part, and I'm going to have an F sharp in the tenor part. Why have I done that? Why not have a B in the tenor and the F sharp in the alto? Well, the alto could have taken the F sharp. If I put B in the tenor, it would have doubled up with a bass note, so that's a slightly kind of weak chord, if you like. Also, a repetition between one chord and another. This F sharp is in chord 1, and it's also in chord 6. A bit of repetition like that between chords that are changing kind of stabilizes the move from one chord to the next. So sometimes that's really quite a useful thing to do. Okay, so we don't want alto and tenor parts jumping all over the landscape. So how about this? I'm going to use this top note in the tenor, then we've kind of got it out of our system. But chord 4, G, B and D, G, G, B, D. See how that's working? And again, we have this repetition of F sharp going between chord 1 and chord 6. Now in the alto, we're repeating this B between 6 and 4. So it just binds the chord changes together. Okay, let's go on to the next one, which is chord 5. and I'm looking, of course, for A, C sharp and E. Why have I decided to do things like that? Well, the A is just next door to the B, so that gives us a bit of stable movement there, doesn't it? And the E isn't too far away from that G either. And I wonder if you've spotted another possibility. It gets exciting as you go. G to E in the tenor means this is a falling third. We could slip in a passing note in the tenor part. How about this? That works rather well, doesn't it? Passing notes in the bass, passing notes in the bass, passing notes in the tenor, passing notes in the bass, passing notes in the treble part, the soprano part. So we're sharing around these passing notes. We've got this stability of repeated notes. We've got quite a bit of stepwise movement going on in these middle parts as well, which keeps life nice and stable. We don't want them leaping all over the landscape. Okay, chord 1B. Well, how about we do this? Because these are using the notes of chord 1. We know about the first inversion. Nice repetition there in the alto. Stepwise movement in the tenor. All works very nicely with the passing note in the bass, the passing note in the soprano to follow. So that's all great stuff. Okay, I'm going to come back to this chord, if you'll forgive me for a moment. We're looking for chord 1. No, we're not. We're looking for chord 4 there. So there's chord 4. Chord 4, of course, is G, B and D. G, G, B, D, so that all belongs to chord 4. And then we're looking for a 1 at the cadence. And again, I'm trying to choose notes that belong to chord 1 that give me some stability. A repeated note in the tenor there, that D belonging to 4 and to 1. Stepwise movement in the alto part there. Okay, now let me just go back to why I've been trying to forget about talking about this chord for a while. I'm going to do something here and then I'll explain what I've done. And you might be alarmed to see me writing an A in the alto part, because you might have heard earlier we were talking about using chord 4 there, weren't we? And you look at chord 4, G, B, D, and you think, well, what's A got to do with chord 4? Well, absolutely nothing at all. However, I'm using a device there, and this device is called a suspension. Now, you might well already know about suspensions, so forgive me if you've rehearsed this territory before. How does a suspension work? It's got 3 parts to it. You have to prepare for a suspension, you have to sound it, you have to resolve it. So this note is preparation, this note is the suspension sounding, this note is the suspension resolving. PSR. Prepare, sound, resolve. Okay, P must belong to this chord. So it must be a note that belongs to that chord, in this case, this 1B chord. R must be a note that belongs to this chord. But S is the note that's dissonant with this chord. So S will not belong to this chord. But S must be the same note as P. So, a bit confusing, I know. 3 steps, PSR, prepare, sound, resolve. Prepare belongs to this chord. Resolve belongs to this chord. S will clash with this chord, but it must be the same note as it was for P. So this is a suspension. It's a bit of a sort of scrunchy moment in the music. Why have I put 9/8 under it? Because you label your suspension in terms of the interval above the bass. Now we've got a G in the bass. This A is a 9th above it. So at the point of S, we label that 9. When we go to R, it steps down to 8 above the bass. The fact that the bass leaps an octave is neither here nor there. It's going from 9 above the bass note to 8 above the bass note. So this is a 9/8 suspension. You get 9/8 suspensions in Bach. You frequently have 4/3 suspensions. Here's an example of a 4/3 suspension. Can you see I've got a note at the top there? That's my P. It sounds again for sound, and then it resolves onto this note. You can see that this note fits with this chord, it clashes with this chord, and then it resolves. But above the bass, it's going 4 to 3. So you can have a 9/8, you can have a 4/3, you might well have a 7/6. Those are the most common ones that you would meet in Bach chorales. S to R always resolves by step, nearly always downwards. So nearly always downwards, but always by step. And it does sound rather nice. If I play from the last chord of this bar, you can see how it goes. Without the suspension, it sounds like this. If I put the suspension in, you can hear that lovely clash, can't you? Listen for it. And then it resolves. So it's another way of sprucing up the impact of the harmony. We've got some passing notes in. Now we've used a 9/8 suspension on the approach to that first cadence. Great stuff. Let's move on, get some harmony in here. Don't forget we're in A major, so we need to use these chords, not these chords. We're looking for a 1B now, aren't we? Now then, where should we go next? We could perhaps do that. Maybe a little bit of a leap in the tenor there won't do us any harm. And then I'm going to go on to do this, I think. You can see again, we've had a leap in the tenor, but then we don't want another big leap in the same direction. A repetition is quite a nice thing to do after a leap there. And again, we're finding a note that's common to 1B and to 4, just to stabilize things. And again, I'm just filling in notes that belong to these chords. And just to sort of speed things up a little bit, I'll just carry on doing what we've done before, because I'm sure you've got the idea of this by now. 1C we're looking for now. You see how I'm trying to get these middle parts to repeat or to move by step. Okay, now this bar is starting to plodding crotchets a little bit. We had a passing note there, now we've got crotchet, crotchet, crotchet. So I'm just looking to see if there's something we can do here. And here's a little idea that we do this. Now you might think, well, hang on a minute, that's not a passing note. It doesn't go by step. No, it doesn't. B up to D. Well, we're using chord 5. Here's chord 5, E, G sharp, B. D is the 7th. And what I'm doing there is starting with a chord 5. By adding a D to it, I'm turning that 5 into 5/7. Now you never go 5/7/5 because that would be starting with a strong chord and weakening it. But if you start with a 5 and then you manage to tip a 7th into it, you strengthen the chord. So here's 5, and we're just going to strengthen it with that 7th. So you can see the effect of that 7th. And it's giving us a bit of quaver movement where we've just begun to get stuck in crotchets there. Okay, now then, I'm going to go on like this. And you can see we've got nice stability in the alto here, repeated E's. You might be starting to think, gosh, this alto part's a bit boring, isn't it? You know, with B, B, A, E, E, E. Actually, if you get some repetition and stability, particularly into the alto part, that's normally a sign of good harmony. It's bringing stability to things. But Bach is very keen on doing that as well, and you'll find whole chorales where the alto part's just repeating the same note for quite a long time. One thing to think about with 5/7, because we've just tucked that D into the tenor there, which has made 5 into 5/7, is this. Once you have a chord 5/7, so here it is in the key of A, which we're in at the moment, when you resolve a 5/7, the 7th always wants to pull down. You can hear that note screaming to go there. So it wants to come down by step. And also in a 5/7, the 3rd normally wants to climb by step. So you can hear the 7th falls by step, the 3rd rise by step. So you can see here's the 3rd, it's rising by step. Here's the 7th, it's falling by step. So that's something you probably want to think about doing when you're dealing with the resolution of a 5/7 chord. Okay, let's motor on to the last phrase. We're back in the key of D, and we're now looking for notes that belong to chord 1 in the key of D. So here we go. That's all quite sort of stable movement on from the previous notes there, isn't it? Now, we're going to have to do something else here. A bit of a leap going on there in both those middle parts, but I think we'll be all right with that for the moment. So hopefully you can see where these notes are coming from. They all belong to those chords. Now remember, this is a 2-7B chord. And we've already talked about the 2-7 there, but in its first inversion. So because there are 4 notes, I kind of really need to use them all, don't I? So I've got the E, the G, the B, and the D. Okay, getting back to a bit of more stepwise movement. That will do nicely there. And we want a chord 1 to finish. The alto needs to come down below that D, and the alto is okay going down to an A, and perfectly okay really going down to a G. You wouldn't want to go much further lower than that G, but that would do there. Now, the last phrase looks as if it needs a little bit of sprucing up. I can see an opportunity for a passing note in the alto part there, so I think we might go for that one. Yeah, so probably things we could do to spruce that corner up a bit further. But anyway, and here I could actually add a passing note in the tenor, which does what we did up here. It is a passing note this time, but that G turns our 5 into a 5-7. So again, 5-1, we've got 5, passing note that makes it a 5-7. It strengthens it onto a chord 1 there. Okay, there are other things that we could do, little tricks that we could add to that, but that's a pretty good working of our chorale. Now, have a listen to what we've ended up with. This is how it goes. You want to make sure that all the notes fit the harmony. You want to make sure that each of these lines has a kind of integrity of its own. May not be exciting, but it just kind of has a sort of melodic integrity. In other words, we're not diving about all over the place. You might have the occasional leap here and there, but making sure it all hangs together. There are other little rules that you want to consider before you kind of complete the thing, like have we got any consecutive fifths or consecutive octaves? That means do we have a perfect fifth between the first chord and the second chord between the same pair of parts? In other words, if the soprano and the alto part had these notes for the first chord, then they went to these notes. This is a perfect fifth, this is a perfect fifth. If it did this and repeated the same notes, that wouldn't be a consecutive fifth. But if it's got this and it moves to another perfect fifth in the same pair of parts, that's called a consecutive fifth. This, between the same pair of parts, would be a consecutive octave. And it's good practice to try and avoid writing consecutive fifths and consecutive octaves. So the way to do this is a bit tedious, but you start with the soprano part, you check the soprano against the alto, then the soprano against the tenor, then the soprano against the bass, then go back to the alto, check the alto against the tenor, check the alto against the bass, then go back to the tenor, check the tenor against the bass, just to make sure there are no consecutives. I don't think there are any consecutives here, I hope there aren't anyway, but if you find one, send me a postcard and tell me where it is. But that's just kind of dealing with that. There are other rules of harmony as well that you can find on some of the films that we've made about advanced harmony, but I hope that at least gives us some flavour of how to tackle a Bach chorale harmonisation.